So here we go. We got about 20 minutes to talk about Bob's memoirs, and everybody has a copy there with their seat. And so I'm going to ask you a few questions.
Well, wait, before you ask me any questions, I want to answer a question. I was asked out in the room the other 15 or 20 minutes ago. 15 or 20 minutes ago, I was asked what I thought of Matt Gaetz, and I said, well, you don't seem to realize that we have the Saturday Evening Club, and it meets 4, 5, 6 times a year. And the last meeting of the Saturday Evening Club, somebody invited Matt Gaetz. And I was appalled by it. And when he came in the room, I said, "You're not invited here." He said, I've been invited. I said, "You haven't been invited. I'm the guy that invites people. I invite you to leave." And you know what? He left. Why do Republicans have problems with this guy, Matt Gaetz? He left when I told him to leave. They can all tell him to leave, and he will leave. Goodbye.
In fact, Bob came up to me and he said, "Paul, I'm going to throw him out." And I said, "You're going to throw who out?" He said, the speaker, Gaetz. Yeah, so he threw him out.
And there was no bounce. He just slouched down the hallway.
So let's start with, people are going to be intrigued by the title of this memoir. And how do we get out of here? And as you can see from the subtitle, right, he mentions in the subtitle Bobby Kennedy. That'd be RFK Sr., with RFK Jr. now suddenly on the map, and Donald Trump. So tell us what inspired this title. Where does this come from?
Well, it comes from ancient history. In 1968, I was at Indiana University on the stage with Bob Kennedy. We were the only two on the stage. He had been invited to be on the stage. I snuck onto the stage. I was 24 years old, and a 24-year-old guy can sneak around at places like that. And I was behind this big black curtain. He was in front of this big black curtain, and he spoke very eloquently. And then he turned, and I didn't know it, and bolted through the curtain where I happened to be standing, and he said, "How do we get out of here?" And I carried that title with me for 50 years. It struck me as a title that it could be put on a book at any time. And I did put it on a book. But before I did it, I said to Bob Kennedy, "Come this way, sir, to the left. No, turn to the right. No, to the left. No." I was hopelessly lost, but so was he. He didn't know it.
But you just turned to the right.
At any rate, what was that again?
But you turned to the right.
Yes. And I said, well, here it is. To the left is where we're going to go. And I took him down the steps to his car. And he opened the door for his car. He sat down, and he reached his hand out to shake my hand. And I thought I had a great idea. I said, "I've got what in my pocket? I've got a Reagan for President button." And I pressed the Reagan for President button into the palm of his hand. And he looked down, and he smiled. And I looked down, and I smiled. And he drove off. And 7 weeks later, he was dead. It was an early example of the kind of treatment we're all experiencing in the world today. The historians call it the first bloodshed of the war on terror, and it's continued on to the very moment that we're sitting here. And let's hope that the Israelis can kick the hell out of those bastards.
You know, we of course couldn't have planned this way, but Robert F. Kennedy Sr. was assassinated on the one-year anniversary of the Six-Day War. So the Six-Day War was June 5th through 10th, 1967, and Sirhan Sirhan assassinated RFK because of his support of Israel in the Six-Day War. In fact, Sirhan's diaries were titled "RFK Must Die," because he wrote over and over again, RFK must die, RFK must die on or near June 5th, 1968. And so, of all things, you were with RFK a month before that, 2 months before that, and you were the man behind the curtain, the only one in the auditorium. And so you placed the Reagan for President button in his hand, which is the hand that's holding the rosary that the busboy Ramiro put in his hand as he was shot in Los Angeles that night, June 5th, 1968.
Yep. It was a sad story, and we'll see if it has a happy ending.
So you founded the magazine in Bloomington, Indiana, campus of Indiana University in 1967, and it was first called The Alternative before the current name, The American Spectator, which changed about a decade or so later. You immediately had these remarkable relationships with so many young writers. George Will started writing for The American Spectator. Bill Kristol started his writing with The American Spectator. And I've always been amazed at how you had the relationships with presidents from the beginning. Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, writing for the magazine, Spiro Agnew. Tell us about your relationship with any of them, maybe Nixon, maybe Reagan, how it related to the magazine.
Well, let me mention Ronald Reagan, because in my lifetime, he's the greatest president to come down the pike. And I started working for him in the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, I continued to work for him. I always worked as an unpaid agent, and that's the way he liked it. You can understand that. At any rate, I worked for him in the 60s and the late 70s and the early 80s. And he had one thing that he wanted to do that he could never get off the ground. He wanted to change the culture of the country. And he understood the culture of the country a lot better than most people do. We call it the culture smog at the American Spectator. And he was in my presence, he actually called it the culture smog too. And he had me as a point man to try to eliminate the craziness of our culture. And we had a dinner at the White House. We had speakers come back and forth to the White House. This was something that he really thought about. He had members of his staff try to fight this contagion, but he couldn't do it. it was a, and it's never been spoken about, I don't think. Have you?
So Reagan talked to you about working with you to create a new conservative counterculture, as he called it. And I got to tell you, so the 1980s, I was an undergrad at the University of Pittsburgh, late 1980s, and I came to conservatism through the American Spectator. In fact, how many people, anybody in the 1980s who came to the magazine during that time, right? Yeah, and with writers like P.J. O'Rourke, Andrew Ferguson, Malcolm Gladwell, Byron York came a little bit later in the 1990s. But he came to you to create a conservative counterculture. The President of the United States at the time.
Yes, he was deeply interested in it. And it was kind of a funny ending. As he was about to leave the White House, he accepted my invitation to come to my house for dinner, and he did, which was kind of a shocking event to me, to have the president arriving at my house. And nonetheless, we had the president, and it was a curious moment for me. But he claimed he used to wear hearing aids, as you might know. And he came down into my living room and he said, "Bob, I'm sorry, I've got to leave." And he walked away. And I thought, what has happened? Has the Secret Service discovered dangerous people in the house? And instead, he came back and he said, "My hearing aids, the hearing aids lost their energy." And at any rate, we ended the evening in a very friendly way, as you could expect. I think Ronald Reagan was the most perceptive person to sit in the White House since Teddy Roosevelt.
Well, then, speaking of a counterculture, the counterculture of the 1960s comes to the White House in the 1990s, and that begins a whole new era for you and the American Spectator. Tell us about Boy Clinton and his lovely wife, Bruno, as you called her.
Well, there's so much about the Clintons that you can't talk about because he keeps it under cover. But I do remember this about Bill Clinton. Of all the presidents, and there were 6 presidents that discussed their problems with me, and I told them what I would have done. Some of the presidents paid no attention to me, and that's a sign that we elect good presidents. Other people, and the one person who did take my advice, took my counsel, was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton came over and talked to me about the Jockey Club in Washington, and he came to me and he was troubled about something or other. Oh, he was troubled about what I'd written about him. That's what he was troubled about.
Which showed that he read your columns.
He insisted he hadn't read a column of mine, but he certainly had read everything I'd written. And I said to him, "Now look, Mr. President, you're getting worked up here. Why don't you go over and sit down and we'll talk about this matter later?" And he went over and sat down, and I had the honor of being just a man on the street who put the president in his place. It was in a dark corner across the room.
Well, the magazine by the 1990s had a circulation of about 330,000, which is really quite remarkable. I mean, in fact, it's really unprecedented for a conservative journal.
350,000.
350,000. Nice. Nice, very nice. Now, moving ahead closer to today, in 2015, 2016, speaking of Donald Trump, you were basically the only major conservative magazine editor who endorsed Donald Trump. I mean, National Review certainly didn't. You came out for Trump early. Trump had spoken at this gala before.
That's right.
And what was it that you saw about Donald Trump that I didn't think he could win? Jeff Lord did, right? A few people did. You did. But I didn't think he could win in 2015, 2016. You thought he could?
I thought he could because he had enormous energy. He had a gregarious nature, and I thought he would overwhelm Hillary. And the reason I thought he'd overwhelm Hillary was, as Tom Wolfe said, Hillary didn't have a chance in 2016 because of the work that the American Spectator did for the preceding 24 years, or 15 years. You kept after them, and Hillary was shot, and she was shot. She couldn't win. Donald ran a wonderful campaign, but I think Donald Duck could have beaten Hillary.
You know, when he had that moment at the presidential debate when Donald Trump brought in some of Bill's women. I mean, a lot of that had been exposed in the American Spectator. I mean,
that's right.
You had exposed Bill exposing himself, right? Prior in the 1990s. And,
yeah.
I mean, so for the country that was surprised about Monica Lewinsky in 1997, 98, the American Spectator was not surprised. I mean, this had been.
No, in fact, the sex act that she did over and over again with Bill, women had complained about Bill time and time again, and they complained about him doing the same sex act as he did with Monica. Monica proved that Bill Clinton had failed as a gentleman, but he made his mark as an absolute rascal.
Do you have any predictions for 2024? Do you think Donald Trump will be the nominee, and what do you think will happen with Republicans?
Well, I think I don't like to be wrong about many things, and I don't like to be wrong about who's going to be president. And right now, this past president is 40 points ahead of the people that he's up against. I can't say that I can't see any other person beating Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump will get the nomination. And I think it's up to us to support Donald Trump. And where he makes a mistake, to tell him it's a mistake. The only problem I see in Donald Trump is he can't stand to quietly soar over his enemies. He falls for a punch every time somebody punches at him. Donald shouldn't do that. He's a better man than that. And I think that he can show us a better campaign in 2024 than he did in 2015, 2016. And he wasn't bad in 2016.
You know, one more question here. Let me bring this full circle back to RFK. Now, RFK Jr. has announced that he's going to run as a third party. And you've written a number of columns recently about the Biden administration refusing to provide Secret Service protection to RFK Jr., which I think was probably a motivation in him getting as angry as he did and bolting and going third party. I mean, how ironic is this?
Well, I've had some contact with RFK Jr., and I think that RFK Jr. should pick up and make an ongoing issue of the fact that the White House has refused to give him Secret Service protection. Imagine if he's shot dead, what people will say about this White House. Of course, it's no surprise that the White House is ducking Robert Kennedy Jr. I think Robert Kennedy Jr. will be a real spoiler in 2024.
Yeah, and just, I mean, imagine of all things, again, to bring this full circle, you know, there was an armed man who snuck into an RFK Jr. rally in Los Angeles a couple weeks ago as a security guard. Imagine if the man had been shot in Los Angeles, just like his father.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason for the Secret Service protection for candidates was because of the assassination of his father, of all things.
No, that's right. And I can't understand these people. This White House never learns. If Bob Kennedy is shot, or if he's even injured, it'll put paid to this White House, and I think it should.
Bob, we're going to finish here. I want to just do one last thing before how do you get out of here, before you step down from the stage. Anybody in this room who's written for the American Spectator, you've done so because this man founded this magazine. Could you please stand up right now? Please don't be shy. That'll include me.
Well, wait a minute. I've written for this magazine too.